In the second episode of Chinese steam locomotives, I will go over the long and interesting history of one of the most successful, influential Chinese steam locomotives ever built, the legendary JF Class 282. The SY Class 282 is my favorite Chinese steam class, followed closely by the larger JF class. The letters JF in Chinese stand for liberation. The JF class started life in 1918 and was introduced by the Japanese and built by Alco, the American locomotive company, and the JF gained a respect as the main heavy freight locomotive in northeast Manchuria. The engine was vital to the modernization of Japan and China in the lead up to the Second World War. The Japanese had very little natural resources, so the JF was very important to keeping materials flowing across China as the Japanese invaded more of China for resources, and many JFs were built in this period to keep the flow of supplies going. After the Chinese liberation in 1949, China was able to build its first locomotive without any foreign aid. This was highly regarded by the Chinese as it proved that they could handle their own locomotive manufacturing, and the first engine produced was a JF, and over 400 were built after 1949. JFs were used as standard heavy freight locomotives for many years, and JF manufacturing ended in late 1950s, but they continued to run for many years, and a few JFs remained in operation all the way up until 2004, and one was still operating as late as 2007. Not bad for a class that was introduced in 1918. Like I said earlier, the first order of JFs were built by Alco in 1918. One of the reasons the engines looked so American, the South Manchurian Railway, the first railway to use them, classed them as Meike 1 locomotives. More engines of the same design were built by the Japanese, and Japan built around 140 of them before an upgraded design was introduced in 1935. The engines received some minor changes at that point, with a shorter boiler, smaller heating surface, and some other minor changes. This design change is usually referred to as the JF1 class, whereas the pre-1935 models were known simply as the JF class. By this time, nearly 2,000 JFs had been built by Japanese builders and at builders in Japanese-occupied China. There is evidence that more JFs were sent to China after the war from Japan as reparations to China. In the end, it is reported that around 1,400 JFs were taken over by the People's Republic of China. However, some of them were destroyed in the Second World War. The building of JFs started up again in 1950, and these were assembled using mostly parts from existing stockpiles of older JF parts. The first locomotive to be completely built with all Chinese parts was JF 2121 in December of 1952. After this, 454 additional JFs were built by various Chinese manufacturers. Records indicate that this batch was built until 1960, but the latest builder plate seen on a JF was 1958. So there is some discussion on whether JF manufacturing actually ended in 1958 or 1960. Eventually, the JF's rolling chassis was integrated into a new JS Class 282 that used a new boiler design that was heavily influenced by the USSR. The JS incorporated both the steam and sand domes into one long dome, unlike the JF that had two separate domes. The stack was also covered by a shroud that helped deflect smoke away from the cab, making the JS look much less American than the JF. Identifying Chinese-built JFs can prove to be difficult. Two JFs confuse the situation. JF 2113 seems to have been built between 1950 and 1952, but has a builder plate from 1957, and JF 100, that was supposed to be a pre-war engine, has a builder plate from 1957 as well. It is speculated that renumbering or boiler replacements may have happened at some point. Throughout the long history and operation of JFs, the locomotives were used all over Chinese rail networks, and most spent their entire lives in mainline service. However, a fairly large number ended up working in industrial operations like steel mills and coal mines. Very few Japanese manufactured JFs were still running after 1990, but JF 508, one of the first built in Japan, and one of the earliest JFs, was seen working at the Collier system up until May 2000 or later. It is not known for sure if this is the original JF 508 or a later one renumbered. No JFs were seen in mainline service after the 1980s, but as said earlier, many of them gained new lives in industrial service many years later. JF6 3472 was used at the Hungeton rolling stock works until 1998, and the Gunshi Sami Railways used JF6 3475 until around 1998 and was seen being rebuilt in October 1999, but the engine has not been seen since then. The last JFs known to be in use were seen at the Changchun and Zhengzhou, and they were run until 2004, and JF 2368 was still running in March of 2005. The last JF that is known to have been in use was JF 2446, and it was last seen running at the rolling stock builder in Beijing in March 2007. Amazingly, JF 886, built in 1936, was rebuilt to running condition in 2006 by the Bipeo Mining Railway and was stored in running order. At least 5 JFs are preserved at the Beijing Museum. There may be more stored in China as well. Also, JF6 3022 is at the Beijing Railway Museum, and JF6 3329 is at the Shenyang Museum. In all, there were several different variants of JF class, starting with the JF1 and ending with the JF51. The legacy and influence of the JF cannot be understated, with its rolling chassis being used for the JS and its design heavily inspiring later Chinese-built SY282s. The SY class was built until 1999 and was the last class of steam locomotive to be built and used in revenue freight and passenger service anywhere in the world. Other than being a little smaller, the SY is the spitting image of the JF, more proof of the JF's enduring appeal and design. Another interesting appearance change with the JF is that early JFs had standard spoked drive wheels, while later JFs had box-pox drivers, and some early engines were converted over to box-pox drivers at some point. China also provided some JFs to North Korea and North Vietnam during the 1950s and 60s. Around 70 engines were sold to the two countries. A number of JFs were also known to have been re-gauged during World War II to prepare for a Japanese invasion of the USSR that never happened. There is also some evidence that some JF-6 class were rebuilt as PL-2 class 262s. This helps explain why there are more PL-2s reported than were actually built. This, however, is not a known fact and may be nothing more than a myth. There were also some JFs built in Japan for the U.S. Army Transportation Corps during the Korean War. The JF class was built by several different manufacturers, including Alco in the U.S., Kawasaki, KSK, Nippon, Hitachi, and the SMR shops in Japan, and Dalian and Saifang in the country of China. The JF class weighed in at 160 tons. I could not find any information on how much tractive effort they produced. Bachmann China makes a fine model of the JF6 class. I am currently looking for one of these to purchase. They are incredibly detailed and accurate models of the JF class and come in a variety of numbers and paint schemes. Bachmann also makes the JS282, the RM462, and the QJ210-2, and the SY282. I have two SY models made by Bachmann, an original Chinese version and an American version that I customized to be SY1658 that ran at the Knox and Kane Railroad in the 1990s and is now running at the Valley Railroad in Essex, Connecticut. I also recently purchased an original SY282 builder plate that came off an SY built in 1990. This is now one of my favorite railroad items in my collection. I did the best I could with this video. The JF class has a complex history, and some of the sources that I used had conflicting information. I also apologized if I mangled any Chinese words. Thank you for watching this video. All of the visual media used in the video are slides or postcards that I own. My next video in this series will be on Chinese SL6 and RM Class 462 Pacifics.